Hello, this is History 321. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video lecture number 17. All right, we had finished talking about Huey Long, his come to power in Louisiana, his becoming the governor, his becoming a United States senator, and his uh, assassination in 1935. Now, we also said that he was replaced. Uh, that he was replaced by OK Allen, who was in turn replaced by Richard Lesh, and Lesh winds up going to federal penitentiary because he is corrupt. Um, Lesh's lieutenant governor becomes the governor, and coincidentally, um, the Lesh's lieutenant governor is none other than Huey Long's younger brother, Earl. So Earl uh, finishes out the term of Richard Lesh. Now, Lesh resigns in 1939, and Earl Long finishes the term. So along comes the election of 1940. Now, Louisiana history books refer to this as the Reform election of 1940. The election of 1940 was a backlash against the corruption of the Lesh administration and the Longites, who still wielded a lot of power, political power, in Louisiana. And so, remember, we said that reform in Louisiana quite often doesn't take the form of Democrat versus Republican or vice versa. It takes the form of are you for the Longs or are you against the Longs? And if you're against the Longs, then you are considered to be a reformer. And that's exactly what happens in 1940. Opponents of Long run under the banner of reform. Now, the reformers consisted of old enemies of the Longs who had promised and they promised to clean up state government by driving the rascals out. We're going to get rid of all the Long faction. The problem was that many anti-Longs themselves had been involved in questionable deals. Uh, it seems funny how things like this keep coming back and back. Remember when the Republicans were removed from office at the end of Reconstruction, they were accused of being very corrupt, and they were replaced by the Democrats, who themselves were just as corrupt. In similar fashion, the Long faction, it is true that they very well might have been corrupt, but the reformers who replaced them were equally corrupt. Problem was that many of the anti-Long faction had been involved in these questionable deals. And so, to try to avoid being painted as corrupt, the anti-Longites chose as their candidate an attorney from Lake Charles by the name of Sam Houston Jones. And Sam Jones was squeaky clean. The Longites continued their practice of running people who were rather corrupt or totally corrupt. And they ran the incumbent governor, Earl Long, who had become governor when Lesh was sent to federal penitentiary. Now, there were others in that race as well. There were other candidates for the governorship as well. One was a former governor by the name of James Noe, Noe, and United States, remember the United States House of Representatives from Hammond, James Morrison, Jimmy Morrison. Long finished the primary with 41%, Jones with 29%. Now, we've already talked about what you call this. nobody had a majority, and so nobody wins. What Long has is a plurality. It's not a majority, but it is the most. And as a result, since nobody is the outright winner, the top two vote getters, Earl Long and Sam Houston Jones, go to the primary. I'm sorry. They have survived the primary. Now they are going to go to the runoff. They're going to go to the general election. And in that election, an upset takes place. Jones defeats Long in the runoff. It is a close election. Sam Jones wins by fewer than 20,000 votes, but it nevertheless is a victory. And at least on paper, the Longs have been turned out of office and have been replaced by a reformer, but a reformer in the true sense of the word, perhaps. Jones was a legitimate reform governor. Even for Louisiana, he was really a reform governor. He promised to restore honesty and integrity to state government. And he persuaded the legislature itself to create and pass reform legislation. Now, what did some of that legislation deal with? Well, it abolished the deduct system of Dick Lesh. Remember that Lesh had this slush fund, and he required, if you were a state employee, he required that you voluntarily donate 10% of your total check to the slush fund. It was called, in theory, that somewhere there was this box, and this money was put into the box. Now, no one knows if a box ever actually existed, but nevertheless, it was called the deduct because that 10% was deducted from your paycheck before you ever saw it. It abolished the deduct system of Richard Lesh. It abolished nepotism. The idea that if you are a politician and you are in a position of responsibility and authority, it's now illegal for you to hire your child or your neighbor or your relative um, simply based on the fact that they are your relative or they're your friend. It does not mean that your children or your neighbors cannot hold a state job. What it means is they need to be qualified for it, right? Um, Sam Jones abolished double dipping. The idea that a politician could have more than one political job at the same time. You could no longer be, for example, a Louisiana state senator and be a police juryman from your home parish. Can't do that anymore. Sam Jones, working through the legislature, opened voter registration rolls to public inspection. In order to see who was registered to vote, all you had to do was fill out the right paperwork, and those records would be opened to you for your inspection. He reorganized many state boards and state commissions. And of course, the implication here is that many of the state boards and many of the state commissions were corrupt, and he's going to do away with that corruption. Now, Sam Jones does something that's never been done before. He installed a civil service system in Louisiana to fill state jobs. Now, we think nothing of that today because that's the way it is today, and it's been like that a long time. And quite often, we are convinced that just because a thing has been in existence for a long time, it means it's always been in existence, but that's not the case with civil service. Today, when you graduate from Southeastern, and I hope every one of you do, let's assume that you want to get a state job, right? You want to be a game warden, or you want to work in the accounting department in Baton Rouge, or something like that, right? You want to work in the children's protective services. How do you get that job today? Everybody who wants that job takes the same test, and then the job is filled from the people who make the best scores on the test. It is a competitive examination that is fair because everybody who takes the test takes the same test, and nobody plays favorites. Right? Now, before that, how did people get state jobs? Well, you knew somebody, right? It was that, or you bribed somebody. That's the way state jobs were filled. And Sam Jones made the first attempts to do away with that system. Now, he could not fix all of the corruption in that old-fashioned system. There were limits to the uh, civil service reforms that he could make. For example, the reforms were passed through the legislature in 1940, but they did not start. They were not put into practice until 1942. And before we paint a picture of Sam Jones that has him sitting at the right hand of God as this perfect governor, we also need to tell you that in that 2-year period between 1940 and 1942, that 2-year period gave Sam Jones the opportunity to weed out opponents from state jobs and replace them with his supporters. And then the competitive examinations for the remaining state jobs began to be conducted. Now, that sounds to be inconsistent with the role of a reformer, and you're right, it is inconsistent. But despite inconsistencies like that, Jones was really a reformer, especially in Louisiana. He put an end to the flagrant corruption of the Longs and the Longites. He restored checks and balances to state government, where the governor could no longer literally control what happened in the state of Louisiana. And even if in some ways he was as partisan, which is a fancy word that means place favorites, right? Even though in some ways he was as partisan as the people who had come before him, he was not corrupt. He was not corrupt. And he could claim real accomplishments. Now, so Sam Jones serves as the governor of Louisiana. He's elected in 1940. And then in 1944, another governor's election, a gubernatorial. That's the fancy word, right? The next gubernatorial election takes place. Now, the anti-Long faction runs a man by the name of Jimmy Davis, Jimmie, for the governorship. Jimmy Davis at that time was a member of the Public Service Commission from the Shreveport area. Remember, serving on the Public Service Commission is where Huey Long got his political start in the state of Louisiana. Now, Sam Jones, the Constitution prevented himself from succeeding himself. In other words, he couldn't be elected to 2 consecutive terms. So everyone knew that he was going to be out of office in 1944. The Long faction, which was still in existence, ran a man from St. Tammany Parish by the name of Lewis Morgan for the governor. And Earl Long ran along with Morgan as Morgan's lieutenant governor running mate. Sam Jones endorsed Jimmy Davis. Remember, Jimmy Davis is the anti-Longite. Louisiana voters still remembered the scandals of the Longites, And Louisiana voters successfully elected Jimmy Davis in the election of 1944 by, it's not a wide margin. It's not a real narrow. Let me say it this way. It's not a real narrow margin, but it is rather narrow. By a total of about 35,000 votes. Jimmy Davis becomes the new governor of the state of Louisiana. Now, what did Jimmy Davis do while he was the governor of Louisiana? And the answer is rather simple. Not much. Jimmy Davis was a do nothing. Now, if you're related to Governor Davis, I'm sorry to break your heart, but Jimmy Davis was basically a do nothing governor. His greatest talent, he was a singer, right? And the song "You Are My Sunshine" that most of us know was sung first, I think, by Jimmy Davis. It was a big hit. Um, his greatest talent, though, was not in politics. It was not in government. He was an entertainer. And he was always on the road singing at different places. During his term of office, 365 times 4, right? About 1,500 days. He was outside the state of Louisiana for more than 300 of those days. He was on the road singing. Now, before I paint a completely negative picture of Jimmy Davis, I do have to tell you that he did accomplish a number of things. He balanced the state budget. Now, folks, that is not a small accomplishment. He actually was able to balance the state budget, and he increased the spending for education for both white children and for black children. He helped create a state employment retirement system for Louisiana employees, and he increased the amount of state old age pension. However, when 1948 rolls around, he's out because he can only serve for the 4 years, right? And so in the election of 1948, former Governor Sam Jones again ran as the candidate of the anti-Longites, while Earl Long, who by this time was the former governor of Louisiana, remember he had served out the remainder of Dick Lesch's term, and Earl Long ran for the Long faction. Both candidates made many, many, many public service promises. Long correctly perceived that the voters were ready for a change. He promised heavy spending. This is Long now. He promised heavy spending for teacher salaries. He promised heavy spending for veterans bonuses, World War II veterans, Louisiana's World War II veterans. And he promised increases for old age pensions. Now, quite often, the only issue that really matters for many people is what is how is this going to affect my bank account? Is this going to save me money? Is this going to make me money? Well, many folks looked at Long and they came to the conclusion that if he was elected, they were going to be better off financially than they would be if Sam Jones was elected to a second non-consecutive term. Plus, Long was a colorful campaigner. If you've seen any of the old footage of Earl Long campaigning, boy, he was a ball of fire. He knew how to make a speech. And as a result, Long was elected by a large number. More than 200,000 votes separated Long from Jones. And not only was Long elected rather easily, The candidates for seats in the Louisiana state legislature that he supported also won. About 75% of the candidates that he supported were actually elected to the Louisiana state legislature. All right, so let's talk about Earl K. Long. Honestly, it was sort of a return to the corruption of the past. Long was rather than say Long, let me say Earl Long, and that way that'll isolate him from Huey, his brother. We'll know which Long I'm talking about. Earl Long was really unconcerned about integrity, whether it was political integrity or whether it was financial integrity. He was not really concerned about how he was going to keep the promises that he had made during the campaign. Remember, um, heavy spending for teacher salaries, veterans bonuses, old age pensions. Long was willing to make any promise if it would get him elected. And then he would worry about if he could keep the promise. Now, in order to keep his promises was going to require a lot of money. Where was the money going to come from? Well, uh, it would come from tax increases. Louisiana at that time already had a sales tax. Long doubled the sales tax. There were also big increases in the taxes on alcoholic beverages. Quite often we refer to as the sin tax, right? The idea is that the people who pay the tax are the people who use the service. They're the ones who drink the beer. They're the ones who drink the booze. Let them pay the tax. And the others who don't drink, they won't have to worry about it, right? The sin tax. He also raised gasoline taxes. And of course, now that affected everybody. If you drove a vehicle, that affected you. The result was an increase of 50% in state sales taxes of different kinds. Now, some people noticed this, but the reality is that before Earl K. Long became the governor, Louisiana had one of the lowest tax rates in the entire nation. Most of the cost of government was paid for by the taxes on big businesses. And the people were not required to pay heavy taxes. And so, even when the state sales tax, which did affect the people, when that went up by 50%, it didn't really hurt a lot of people because that tax had been so low to begin with. So, Louisiana still, after all of that, Louisiana still enjoyed one of the lowest tax burdens in the entire United States of America. And the taxes did pay for uh, ex- expanded social service programs. Old age state pensions were raised to $50 a month. I mean, today's $50 a month is chump change. But back then, $50 a month, if you were a poor white or a poor black, and by definition, most blacks were poor, an increase to $50 was an appreciable increase. Earl Long expanded the school hot lunch program. Then, as now, a hot lunch at school quite often was the only hot meal that many of these children received each day. There were substantial teacher pay raises. As a matter of fact, Earl Long, in a in what is a rather surprising decision, successfully caused the salaries for black teachers and white teachers to be the same. No longer would black teachers be discriminated against by receiving much lower salaries. No. Now, in Louisiana, both white and black teachers make the same money. Every World War II veteran got a bonus of $1,000. New schools were built. New roads, new highways, new bridges were built. Improvements were made to the state charity hospitals, many of which had been created while Earl Long's brother Huey was the governor. Vocational training institutions were established. State mental institutions were expanded and improved. I'm sorry, that's funny, because when we get to the right place, we're going to discover that a few years down the road, Earl Long is going to need a mental institution that has been improved from the bad old days. At first, Louisianians resisted. They resented these tax increases, even though they were very small. But when they saw what they were getting, when they realized the bang that they were getting for their buck, much of that resistance to the tax increases went away. Now, there were some other things that he did that were not so nice. He repealed the civil service program of former Governor Sam Jones. And when that was done, he immediately fired thousands of state employees that he suspected were supported reform in Louisiana, and he replaced them with the members of his faction, the Longite faction. He used legislation passed in Baton Rouge in the state legislature to reduce the power of city government in New Orleans. The city of New Orleans had never been a big fan of Huey Long, and the city of New Orleans was not a big fan of Earl Long either. And Earl Long did his best to punish the city of New Orleans for its lack of support for him and his programs. He reduces the power of city government, and he cuts state revenue, tax money that's coming from the state of Louisiana and given to the city of New Orleans. He cut that state revenue to New Orleans by 50%. Probably as bad, or maybe even worse, I think worse, than anything else that he did. He created an open partnership with organized crime. Organized crime made, we think, as much as a $500,000 contribution to his gubernatorial campaign. And of course, the assumption was that organized crime got something for that, right? You give me $500,000, and I'm going to give you something in return that you want. Well, what was it that the mafia, organized crime, got? Well, new gambling casinos all over the state of Louisiana. Slot machines and pinball machines in every beer joint and bar and pool hall in Louisiana. Bookies, especially horse racing bookies, operated in broad open daylight. Prostitution becomes more common in the eyes of many, more common than it has ever been in the state of Louisiana. During his time as governor, Between 1948 and 1952, he regularly received kickbacks and payoffs for maintaining this new criminal relationship between himself and organized crime. As a matter of fact, he didn't care who knew it. He was often seen in the company of known mobsters at the racetrack, where he bet on races that had been fixed. Wow. Now, Louisiana voters were watching the actions of Earl Long. In November 1948, they defeated all 9 proposed constitutional amendments that he supported. And as it turns out, Earl Long is, in fact, teachable because he got the message. He got the message that the voters of Louisiana had sent. And he tried to be more moderate in his policies and in his behavior. For example, he sort of had a group hug. He kissed and made up with the city of New Orleans. He freed state funds. State funds were now flowing back into the city. And he returned control of the city to the city. Feeling that voters had forgiven him, Earl Long then decided to adopt a new state constitution and write into it his pet programs. Now, it is true that a new state constitution was badly needed, and we'll talk about that a little later in the course. But for right now, it's enough for you to understand that he is suggesting something that's really, really badly needed. The problem was that he was still too greedy, and he tried to write into the Constitution his little pet programs. He tried to have an organization called the Louisiana Law Institute, which was a non it was a nonpartisan group. He tried to put that group into his back pocket. In other words, to buy their influence, buy their support, so that they would come out in favor of this new constitution. But it became known what he was trying to do, and the state of Louisiana was outraged. He asked the Louisiana state legislature to create that new document. And guess what? The Louisiana legislature refused. They canceled his call for a constitutional convention rather than create a new constitution that would generally do whatever he wanted to do. Now, as always, there are pluses and minuses with Earl Long. What were some of the pluses? Well, it seems that Earl Long had a real sympathy for the poor and the unfortunate and the needy and the downtrodden. This was not anything fake. He really did care. Because how else do you explain his career long work, for example, to create and then increase social welfare benefits? To create, well, not to create, I'm sorry, but to finance that statewide charity hospital system, to expand schools, to build new schools, expand old schools, to provide significant pay raises for the teachers and make the pay of black and white teachers equitable, and the funding of old age pensions. Those are all things that we cannot deny. Earl Long accomplished those things. But what about his minuses? And there were minuses. Alliances with mobsters damaged his reputation, as well as the reputation of the state of Louisiana as a whole. Tax increases showed that supporting Long and supporting the Longists came at a considerable cost to Louisiana citizens. Nevertheless, he proved to be a rather popular governor. Some political scientists say there's a real reason why Louisiana voters were fascinated with Long. They say that we have always been fascinated by the bizarre. And in many ways, Earl Long's behavior, especially his future behavior, can only be described by the word bizarre. As a matter of fact, some of those same political scientists say that at the end of his governorship in 1952, that if the Constitution had permitted him to be reelected for a second consecutive term, the people of Louisiana very well might have reelected him to that second term. All right. But he couldn't succeed himself. And so the election of 1952 rolls around. He backed a man by the name of Carlos Spot, Spahtt, who was from Baton Rouge, while the anti-Longites supported Judge Robert Kennon, Kennon. Judge Kennon was from Minden. Other well-known figures ran for the governorship as well. The lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana during Long's 1948 to 1952 tenure was a man by the name of William Dodd. And Dodd broke with Earl Long and ran against Long's hand-picked man, Carlos Spot. Another rather famous name in Louisiana history ran for the governorship in the 1952 election as well. His name was Hale Boggs, Haleboggs. Hale Boggs was a U.S. congressman and ran for the governorship in 1952. Now, there were other men who run for the governorship in 52 as well, whose names might not be quite so familiar to us, but which we should nevertheless mention. One of these lesser-known men was a man by the name of Kermit, Kermit, like Kermit the Frog. Yeah, Kermit Parker. He was a pharmacist from New Orleans, and he became the first black Louisianian to run for statewide office in the 20th century. Lucille Grace, who was the registrar of the state land office, became the first woman to ever run for governor at any point. Now, Kennon won that election by almost 175,000 votes, and his victory at the time, was interpreted by many to be a clear repudiation of Longism. So let's talk about Judge Robert Kennon for a few minutes. Long, remember, had increased taxes in order to pay for social services. But he spent more money than the state was bringing in, and the result was the state was going more and more and more into debt. Kennon, now Governor Kennon, persuaded the legislature to pass an amendment to the Constitution requiring a 2/3 vote to raise taxes in the future. No longer would it be rather simple to raise taxes. You can still raise taxes, but you can only do it with a 2/3 vote in the state legislature. Kennan also created strict controls on spending. He decreased the amount that the state was spending on most of those social programs that had been created by law. And by doing that, by the time he leaves office 4 years later, the state is no longer in debt, but it has a surplus in the uh, state treasury. Now, why today um, uh, cutting back on social services would be an almost guarantee that when you ran for re-election, you'd be defeated. But remember, Louisiana governors only serve one term, and so Kennan knew that he could do this and not have to pay the political price because he was going to be out of office in 4 years, whether the people liked him or not, or whether they liked his programs or not. Now, there was also, in addition to financial reform, there was also civil service reform. Okay, let's go back. We said that Sam Houston Jones, had created civil service reform in Louisiana to where the state jobs went to the most qualified candidate. And then we said that Earl Long canceled all of that. Well, Long is out of office. He's been replaced by um, Robert Kennan, and Kennan restores the civil service system that had been canceled by Earl Long. And he does it in a wise way. Judge Kennan, Governor Kennan, puts civil service into the Constitution. The Louisiana Constitution is amended in such a way that the existence of the civil service is now not just a policy that can be created and then destroyed, but it is a part of the Constitution of the state of Louisiana. Now, it can still be done away with, but it's difficult. Remember, what he said was that creating new amendments will require a 2/3 vote, and that's hard to achieve. He wrote tough provisions into law that protected the jobs of state workers, and he restored those competitive exams where only the best people who scored the highest scores on the exams would get the job. And in a direct slap at Earl Long, he became the anti-crime governor. He launched an attack on organized crime, including gambling and prostitution, bookmaking, casinos, slot machines. Now, there was a lot of pressure on Governor Kennan as he was doing these things. There was a lot of pressure on him from the Longite faction. But he continued the pressure. And he left office with a solid record of reform accomplishments. Many political scientists and historians say that Robert Kennan was probably one of the best governors that Louisiana ever had. Now, he couldn't succeed himself, right? So, in the election of 1956, the main campaign issues were increasing assistance to the elderly, conflict with the federal government over the ownership of oil and gas wells in the Gulf of Mexico, improved education, and improved highways. All of the candidates promised not to increase taxes. Earl Long runs again, and he can do this because he's been out of office now for 4 years. Earl Long ran again and received a large majority in the first primary and was elected rather easily. All right? So, Uh, it's a non-issue. No second primary. He wins in no runoff. He wins in the first primary. And so Long is now in office for another 4 years, and he will serve from 1956 through 1960. Long attempted to continue his old policies of high taxes. Oh, excuse me, itchy nose. His high taxes, loose spending, and um, giving jobs to his political uh, cronies. But Bob Kennan's reforms, which were now in the Louisiana Constitution, right? Not easily done away with. Now that they're in the Constitution, Kennan's reforms blocked many of Long's attempts to get back to the bad old days. It's not Earl Long's policies that get him in hot water when he's the governor in between 1956 and 1960. It's his behavior. He would come into the legislature and walk up to the front and take over a meeting and literally rant and rave and cuss inside the legislative chamber. He openly carried on. You know what I mean when I say carry on, don't you? I'm not going to get specific. You know exactly what I'm saying. He carried on with a woman by the name of Blaze Starr. She was a 23-year-old French Quarter stripper. His behavior became so bizarre that his wife, Blanche, and his nephew, U.S. Senator by now, U.S. Senator Russell Long. Remember who I told you earlier that Russell Long was the son of Huey Long? Well, Earl's wife, Blanche, and his nephew, Russell, had him committed to a mental institution in Galveston, Texas. They thought that he had gone off the deep end. Now, after 2 weeks, he makes arrangements to have himself transferred from the mental institution in Galveston to the Southeast Louisiana State Mental Hospital, which at that time was in Mandeville. Now, the problem is, now, Huey Long might be crazy, but I'm sorry, Earl Long might be crazy, but Earl Long is not stupid. And he knows what the law is. He's back on Louisiana soil. And when he comes back on Louisiana soil, guess what? That means he's the governor again. He filed for separation from his wife, Blanche. And what that did, that took away her legal right to have him committed. He then, now he does all this from inside a mental institution. Now you think that's bizarre? You think this is a fictional story? There can't be any truth. Oh no, this is a true story. He then fired the mental institution. He fired the director of the hospital and replaced him with a political friend who immediately declared that Long was sane. A court hearing was held, and that court hearing, the ruling of the court hearing was that, yes, he is sane. And since a sane person, by law, could not be confined to a mental institution, they ordered his release. Now, all that happens in 1959, 1960. mental health medicine was not nearly as advanced then as it is now. Now, I tell that story and I tell it as if it's a humorous story, but that's not funny when you think about it. Someone's mental health is not a laughing matter. If those things had happened today, Earl Long probably would have been diagnosed as being bipolar because he was happy and as a lark one day and he was down in the dumps the next day. And that is sort of the mark of bipolarism, what we call manic depression. And there are medications that can sort of ease the peaks and the valleys and permit a person to function in society. But that didn't exist back then. Um, Earl Long went to his grave using that episode. Uh, he said, uh, how many of you can prove that you're not crazy? He said, I can prove I'm not crazy. I've got a piece of paper that says I'm not crazy. Now, what about race issues? Well, you probably know where I'm going with this one because I've already talked about uh, Earl Long's relationship to Louisiana blacks. For all of his faults, he was a supporter of black voting, which was so far ahead of its time in the South. It was just unbelievable that Earl Long in the 40s and in the 50s, think about this now, was in support of black voting. Now, what was his motive? Well, who cares what his motive? I mean, some people say, well, he supported black voting because if he supported black voting, then he would get the black votes and that would make him successful in his political career. Who cares what his motives were? The bottom line is that black Louisianians did in fact get the vote. And that's got to be a good thing. I'll give you some examples. During the first time that he was a 4-year, remember he had served out Lesh's term, but let's don't count that. That was a year or so. He was elected on his own in 1948, and between 1948 and 1952, black voting registration increased in Louisiana from 7,000. Now that's a terrible number, isn't it? But that number shouldn't surprise us. Remember, we've talked about how the Constitution of 1898 almost completed the disenfranchisement of most Louisiana blacks. And as late as 1948, with half Louisiana's population being black, only 7,000 of those black Louisianians could vote. During Long's term, from 1948 to 1952, that number went to 110,000. 7,000 to 110,000. And no, I did not stutter. That's not a mistake. From 7,000 to 110,000. It was the highest total in the entire South. Now, did Long have an ulterior motive? Well, probably. Probably. He probably thought that since blacks were the recipients of many of his social programs, that by giving the vote, they would vote for him. And by the way, they were right. He was right. At the same time that Earl Long was the governor of Louisiana, segregationists, let me say that again, segregationists in the South, no, segregationists in Louisiana were at the same time attempting to take away black voting rights. And as a result, Long fought and won against the purging of black citizens from the voting registration rolls. It had already been done once, right, as a result of the Constitution of 1898. And here were white, powerful Louisiana politicians who were now suggesting that the same thing be done again. Long fought and won against that. Unfortunately, Little notice was taken of that stand because at the same time when he was doing that, he was also acting so bizarre, such strange behavior. And so whenever the national media or even the local press, whenever they wrote a Earl Long story, it was not about his attempts to bring black Louisianians into the political mainstream. There were stories about how bizarre he was acting, how he was philandering with a stripper in New Orleans, right? Now, once again, uh, Earl Long could not be elected to succeed himself. So uh, he ran for a seat in the United States House of Representatives in 1960, and he was elected. But he never served in the House because he passed away before he could take the oath of office to officially become a member of the House. All right. Let's talk about the election of 1960 before we finish this video. We might run a little bit over, but please bear with me. In the governor's election, the gubernatorial election of 1960, most candidates ran on a platform of unyielding opposition to racial segregation. No, I said that wrong. To racial integration, right? They didn't want the races to be mixed. Or let me say that again and say it right this time. Most candidates ran on a platform of unyielding opposition to racial integration. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court had ruled in a ruling called Brown versus Board that segregation of the races was wrong. And 1 year later, they issued, now that ruling was called Brown versus Board. A year later, in a decision that we still call Brown versus Board number 2, the Supreme Court said that schools should integrate by using all deliberate speed. Well, Southern racists liked that part that says deliberate because they assumed that that meant slowly. And they ignored the word speed, right? White Southerners continued to resist integration, and Louisiana was no exception. The two main Democratic candidates in the 1960 election were a man by the name of Deliceps Morrison. All right, now let me spell that name. Deliceps. It's D-E like the French word D-E. Okay, it's the small D-E, capital L-E-S-S-E-P-S, and it's pronounced Deliceps. Deliceps Morrison was one of the two main Democratic candidates in the election of 1960. And guess who's back for another try? Former Governor Jimmy Davis. Morrison led after that first primary. And so the runoff was going to be between Deliceps Morrison and Jimmy Davis. Now, Davis had run his usual peace and love, let's sing You Are My Sunshine. He had, in the first primary, he had run that old-fashioned campaign that he had back in the 1940s. But he knew that now that he was in the runoff with Deliceps Morrison, that he was going to have to change his tactics. He literally, please forgive the pun, he was going to have to change his tune. He accused Deliceps Morrison of being soft on race. And in a way, Jimmy Davis was correct. Now, I'm not saying that Deliceps Morrison, he was opposed to integration. But he was not the radical segregationist that many Southerners were, that many people in Louisiana are. And so what Davis decided to do was play the race card. He accused Morrison of being soft on race. And by the standard of the times, Delaceps Morrison probably was softer on race than many of the other candidates. He did, in fact, sympathize with black Louisianians. But Jimmy Davis ramped up that racist rhetoric, and at the end of the runoff in the 1960 election, Jimmy Davis found himself back in Baton Rouge as the new governor of the state of Louisiana. All right, we are going to talk about Jimmy Davis again on the next video, but not now. That's all of this one, and I'll see you soon.